The night at the glass harbor shimmered like liquid silver poured across the Boston shoreline. Behind its tall glass walls, laughter rose and clinked like crystal, colliding with the faint hum of jazz and the murmur of ocean waves outside. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved in perfect rhythm, weaving between the tables of executives and investors whose watches cost more than their servers' monthly rent. And among them, steady, quiet, invisible, was Mira Solis, 19 years old, carrying a tray that wobbled slightly under the weight of champagne flutes. She had learned how to disappear in plain sight, chin down, smile polite, voice soft. Her hands were rough from scrubbing dishes in the mornings, but she'd painted her nails pale pink tonight. It made her feel almost like she belonged here. The jazz band in the corner slid into a mellow saxophone solo, and the chandelier light spilled across the sea of designer suits and glittering dresses. Every surface reflected wealth, every sound whispered power, but Mira's eyes weren't on the room. They were fixed on the man at the center table, the one everyone else seemed to orbit around. Calvin Reed, 46, founder of Reed Technologies, the kind of man whose signature could shift the market before breakfast. He sat surrounded by lawyers and partners, the glow of success wrapping him like armor. And yet, there was something unguarded about him as he leaned over a contract, rolling up his sleeve to sign. That's when Mira froze. Her breath caught halfway through her throat. There, under the sleeve of his tailored shirt, she saw it, a tattoo, small, precise, elegant, a constellation of 5 faint stars inked in black, forming the harp-shaped pattern of Lyra, with fine numbers etched below, 42.35 dirn, 71.05 dig, and under the coordinates, Roman numerals, M, June 14th, 2000. Mira's fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles turned white. She'd seen that exact constellation before. Every single dot, every number, every line, on her mother's wrist. Her mother, Dana, who never talked about her youth. Her mother, who said that tattoo was a souvenir from a dream that never came true. Mira felt her pulse in her throat. For a second, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Maybe lots of people liked stars. Maybe it was just coincidence. But then Calvin turned his arm slightly, and the light hit the ink. The coordinates, Boston's harbor, gleamed under the chandelier. Her stomach dropped. The tray tilted. One of the silver spoons slid, hit the marble floor, and the sound sliced through the jazz like a cracked note. The entire section turned their heads. Mira bent quickly, murmuring apologies, cheeks burning. She set the spoon back onto the tray, but her heartbeat refused to slow. From across the table, Calvin glanced up. His eyes were steel gray, the kind that didn't look. They measured. For a moment, they met hers, a flicker. Recognition? No. Impossible. "Everything all right?" his colleague asked him. Calvin nodded faintly and returned to the document, but something about the girl's expression lingered. Mira stood frozen. The air around her felt too thick to breathe. She needed to move, to walk away, but her feet wouldn't listen. The numbers on his wrist glowed in her mind like coordinates burned into memory. The same coordinates she'd once asked her mother about, only to be told, that's where the sky touched the sea. Mira's throat felt tight. She stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. Calvin didn't look up. He was busy signing another page. She tried again, her voice trembling. "Sir, may I ask you something?" This time he looked up, mildly impatient, but polite enough. "Yes?" Mira hesitated. The words tangled on her tongue. She shouldn't say it. It would sound insane, but the moment was already breaking open. I noticed your tattoo," she managed, nodding slightly toward his arm. The men around him fell silent. Even the saxophone outside the room seemed to hush. Calvin's brow furrowed. He followed her gaze to his own wrist. "My tattoo?" "Yes, sir." Mira swallowed hard, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My mother, she has the same one." The spoon clattered again, softer this time. Someone had dropped their cutlery at another table, but no one noticed. Calvin blinked, unsure he'd heard right. "What did you just say?" Mira's heart pounded against her ribs. "The same constellation," she whispered. "Lyra, same coordinates, same date." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then something changed in his face, a quick tightening of the jaw, a flicker of confusion, disbelief, and something else entirely. He looked like a man who'd seen a ghost standing in broad daylight. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Mira," she said. "Mira Solis." Calvin stared at her, as if the air had been sucked from the room. The edges of the world blurred. Even the chatter from nearby tables seemed distant. "Did you say," he began, his voice low, "your mother has this tattoo?" "Yes, sir." Mira nodded, clutching the tray to steady her shaking hands. "She told me she got it when she was studying astronomy at Harborview College, but she never said who—" She stopped herself. The way Calvin's hand trembled around the pen made her words catch. The pen slipped. It hit the table, rolled, and fell. And when it landed, it felt like the sound that split the world into before and after. Calvin leaned back slowly, eyes locked on her, the crowd around them blurring into insignificance. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. Mira opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She could feel the waiters staring, her manager watching from across the room, the hum of the city pressing against the glass walls. But all she could think of was her mother's trembling hand tracing that same constellation years ago, saying softly, "This one sings when someone remembers you." And now, standing before the man with the same ink on his skin, Mira finally understood what that meant. Her lips parted, her voice cracked like glass. "Her name is Dana." The champagne glass Calvin held slipped from his hand. It shattered on the marble floor, a splash of gold and crystal under the chandelier. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The music, the laughter, even the waves outside seemed to hold their breath. Calvin Reed stared at the young waitress before him, pale and shaking, with eyes too familiar to be coincidence. And somewhere deep, inside, a memory long buried stirred awake, a promise made under the same stars 25 years ago. But before anyone could speak again, Mira whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "Sir, my mother has that same constellation." The alarm broke the silence at 4:45 a.m. It wasn't the kind of sound you wake up to. It was the kind that drags you out of dreams before the world is ready. In the half-dark attic of a weathered Dorchester house, Mira Solis blinked against the dim orange glow that seeped through the window blinds. Her room smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. The winter air bit through the thin blanket she pushed aside. For a moment she stayed still, listening. Pipes creaked. The neighbor's heater rumbled. And then, what she dreaded most, her mother's cough. It started quietly, then grew rough, tearing, like it came from somewhere deep inside her lungs. Mira swung her legs over the mattress, feet touching the cold floorboards. "Mom?" she whispered. From behind the faded curtain that divided their attic space came a hoarse voice trying to sound calm. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." Mira pushed the curtain aside anyway. Dana Solis, 40, sat up in bed, hair tousled, a blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders. The gray in her once dark hair caught the first traces of dawn. In her hand was an inhaler, plastic worn from use. She pressed it once. Nothing came out. Mira took it gently. "It's empty again." Dana shrugged, forcing a light tone. "Guess I'll pick up another when I get my paycheck." "You haven't worked since last month." That truth hung between them, heavy and cold as the air in the room. Dana smiled, faint but defiant. "Don't look at me like that, Mira. I've been through worse winters." Her cough disagreed, rattling through her chest until her eyes watered. Mira sat beside her, rubbing her back until the coughing eased. "Please, Mom," she said quietly. "You need to see a doctor." Dana shook her head. "We've talked about this. Doctors mean bills. Bills mean debt. We're already drowning." Mira looked down. There was no point arguing. The math never changed. To fill the silence, Dana reached for the old notebook beside her bed. It was wrapped in a cracked leather cover, corners softened by time. Inside was a folded map of constellations. One Mira had seen since childhood, but was never allowed to touch. When Dana opened it, the paper sighed. Tiny ink dots traced the shape of stars, names handwritten beside them. Lyra, Vega, Altair. Near the bottom, a faint circle around a cluster of stars bore a note in neat script. Lyra, June 14 Mira leaned closer. "You wrote this?" Dana smiled wistfully. "A long time ago." "Was it from college?" "It was from a dream," Dana said softly. "A foolish one." Mira frowned. "What does the date mean?" "A memory," Dana murmured. "One that doesn't need repeating." Her gaze drifted toward the window, to where the first thin light of morning brushed the rooftops. Mira wanted to press for answers, but But her mother's face, the distance in her eyes, stopped her. So, instead she folded the map carefully and placed it back inside the notebook. You should rest. Downstairs, the small kitchen waited in quiet surrender. The bulb above the sink flickered weakly, and frost feathered the edges of the single window pane. Mira filled the kettle, watching steam curl into the gray light. When the whistle began, she poured water into 2 mismatched mugs, then pulled her waitress uniform from the chair, a black dress with a fraying collar and a red apron folded over it. She'd washed it last night in the sink. The laundromat cost $8 she didn't have. As she hung it near the radiator to dry, she checked the envelope pinned to the fridge. Inside, $32. That was all. Rent was due in 3 days, and her mother's next inhaler refill was $26. The kettle whistled louder. She poured tea, one for herself, one for Dana, then took the steps 2 at a time back upstairs. "Drink this," Mira said softly, handing her mother the steaming cup. Dana smiled, her hands trembling slightly around the mug. "You spoil me." "Hardly," Mira said. "This is bargain tea from the corner store." "Still tastes like heaven," Dana murmured, closing her eyes as she sipped. They sat together for a moment, wrapped in the comfort of warmth and silence. The radio downstairs started playing faintly through the floorboards. A weather report, then a woman's voice singing about holding on through storms. Dana looked at her daughter. "You're working tonight again?" Mira nodded. Carol texted. "They're short-staffed." "That's your second double this week." "I need the hours. The tips are better on Fridays." Dana sighed, staring into her tea. "You can't keep running on fumes, Mira." "I'll sleep on the bus," Mira said with a small smile. Her mother chuckled weakly. "I used to say that when I was your age." "When you were in college?" Back when I thought the stars could tell the future." Mira hesitated. "You really studied astronomy?" Dana's eyes softened. "For a little while, until life turned the telescope the other way." The phrase made Mira's chest tighten. "Do you ever miss it?" "Every day." Dana smiled faintly. "But missing something doesn't pay the bills." The smile faded as she set the mug aside and coughed again, thinner this time, but lingering. Mira reached for her hand. "I'll figure something out, Mom. I promise." Dana squeezed her fingers gently. "Don't promise what you can't afford." "I mean it," Mira said, her voice firm now. "I'll find a way. We'll get you checked. I don't care if it's a free clinic or a miracle. You're not doing this alone." Dana looked at her, really looked, and saw that stubborn fire she used to have herself, the kind that could burn through fear. "All right," she whispered. "One miracle. Just don't lose yourself chasing it." "I won't," Mira said, but her throat felt tight. When Dana finally lay back down, Mira lingered. She watched her mother's breathing steady, the rise and fall of her chest. The old notebook with the star map rested beside her pillow, half covered by the blanket. Mira reached out, brushing her fingers against its edge. "Lyra," she whispered to herself. The word felt strange on her tongue, both heavy and familiar. Then she stood, adjusted the curtain, and went back downstairs. The window now glowed with soft light. Snow fell in slow spirals, covering the world in silence. Mira slipped her dried uniform over a chair, tied the apron, and looked at her reflection in the glass. 19, exhausted, but still fighting. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder from her manager. "Don't be late tonight, VIP event again." She typed back, "I'll be there." Then she looked around their small kitchen, 2 chairs, a chipped counter, a flickering bulb, and whispered to herself, "We'll be fine." She folded her tips from the previous night into the envelope, slid it back under the fridge magnet, and scribbled a note on a sticky pad. "Call the pharmacy today. Love you." The bus outside honked twice, the driver signaling the early route. Mira grabbed her coat, wrapped her scarf twice around her neck, and stepped into the morning air. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the sky had started to lighten. Somewhere beyond the thick clouds, the constellation Lyra still waited. And though she didn't know it, the same pattern inked into a stranger's skin was already pulling her life toward a collision she could never have imagined. From the 36th floor of Reed Technologies, the city of Boston looked almost unreal. A mosaic of light and glass stretched toward the harbor, calm and distant beneath the morning haze. Calvin Reed stood by the window, the skyline mirrored in his reflection, like another life pressed against the glass. It was 7:10 a.m. The city below was already awake, horns, fairies, and the low hum of ambition. But inside the corner office, everything was still. Calvin adjusted his cufflink, though there was nothing to fix. His suit was perfect, navy, pressed, immaculate, the uniform of a man who'd built an empire from nothing but precision. Yet when his sleeve shifted, a mark caught the morning light. The tattoo, fine black lines forming the shape of Lyra, the constellation of the harp, inked just above the inside of his wrist. Below it, faint numbers, coordinates that pointed straight to Boston Harbor. And beneath them, a single date carved in Roman numerals. Calvin traced the lines with his thumb, almost unconsciously. It had been 25 years, but the ink still looked fresh. He'd had it done on a summer night that seemed eternal, a night that now lived only in memory. Behind him, the soft chime of the elevator sounded. Patricia, his assistant, entered quietly. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. You have the Meridian Capital follow-up at 9, the press briefing at 11, and lunch with the governor's office at 1. Calvin didn't turn. "Cancel lunch." Patricia hesitated. "They confirmed weeks ago. I said cancel it." His tone wasn't sharp, but it was final. She nodded, leaving him with the silence he seemed to prefer. When the door clicked shut, Calvin's gaze returned to the sea. The water shimmered beneath the early sun, and for a brief second, he wasn't 46 anymore. He was 20, standing barefoot on the dock of Harborview College, salt wind tangling his hair, a girl beside him laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Dana Solis. The name still lived somewhere inside him, even if he hadn't spoken it in decades. The memory unfolded, vivid and merciless. They'd met in an astronomy elective he didn't even want to take. He'd been the scholarship kid in a class full of dreamers. She'd been the dreamer who noticed him. He remembered the way her notebooks were filled with constellations, each star labeled with patient care. The way she said, "If you get lost, look for Lyra. It always finds its way home." He'd laughed back then. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't measure or build. But when she smiled at him, he almost believed in gravity as something more than physics. That summer, they'd sat on the pier, legs dangling over the water, talking about everything they wanted. A world where science met art, where stars were not unreachable, but invitations. And on their 6-month anniversary, she'd surprised him with an idea. "Let's get matching tattoos," she said. He'd choked on his coffee. "You're kidding." "No," she grinned, eyes alive with mischief. "Something small. Our constellation, Lyra. You said it yourself. It's the one you can always find." "I said that to impress you." "Well," she teased, "it worked." That night, in a tiny tattoo shop off Commonwealth Avenue, they inked the constellation into their skin, his on his wrist, hers on the inside of her arm. Under it, she wrote the coordinates of their favorite spot by the water. Under his, he added the date, June 14th, 2000. When the artist asked why, Dana answered, "Because someday we'll meet there again, when we've found what we're looking for." He'd laughed then, not knowing how cruel time could be. The memory darkened. It was late autumn when she told him she was pregnant. The words had been quiet, trembling, hopeful. "Calvin," she said, eyes bright with tears, "we're going to have a baby." He'd stared at her, the air gone from his lungs. Not because he didn't love her, he did, but because love was never part of the plan his father had drawn for him. The next day, he was summoned to the family estate in Beacon Hill. His father, Robert Reed, the man who built fortunes out of fear, waited by the fireplace with a glass of scotch. "You're 20, his father said flatly. "She's a student. This will end your future." She's not part of this world," the man cut in. "You think sentiment will buy you a company? You think love feeds ambition?" Calvin remembered the final words perfectly. "Handle it, or I'll handle it for you." He'd walked out of that room shaking, not from anger, but from the certainty that his life was no longer his. That night, he met Dana on the pier where they had watched stars for months. He brought an envelope, money, a letter he'd rewritten a dozen times, and the lie that would haunt him forever. "Dana," he'd said, "we're too young. You deserve better. I can't do this." She'd looked at him like she was seeing a stranger. "You mean you won't?" He couldn't answer. He pressed the envelope into her hands and walked away. He didn't look back, because if he had, he knew he would never leave. 2 weeks later, she sent a message through a friend. "I lost the baby, don't come." And she was gone. No forwarding address, no phone, no trace. He searched for months, then a year, but eventually, grief became habit, and habit became the wall he lived behind. Now, 25 years later, standing in his glass office overlooking the same harbor, Calvin Reed had everything his father promised: wealth, power, respect, and none of the things that made him feel alive. He had 2 marriages behind him, both ending in silence and settlements. He had friends who congratulated him for winning every deal, yet none who knew what losing felt like. Sometimes, late at night, when the world went quiet, he would look at his wrist, at Lara, and think of a girl who once believed in promises made under stars. He still wore the same watch she'd gifted him on his graduation day, a modest Omega, long since outdated by the luxury brands he could afford. Engraved on the back, almost invisible from where, were the words she'd written herself: "To the stars we promised." He whispered them now, barely audible: "To the stars." But there was no echo, only the hum of the city below. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Patricia's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Reed, your driver's waiting. The Glass Harbor event starts at 7. Calvin exhaled slowly, slipping the watch over the tattoo before the memory could swallow him whole. He straightened his tie, grabbed his coat, and gave one last glance at the window, at the reflection of a man who looked complete, but wasn't. As the elevator doors closed around him, the harbor light flared across the skyline, and far below, at that very moment, a young waitress was climbing the steps of a bus that would take her to the same restaurant, the same night, where both their lives would quietly begin to rewrite themselves. Neither knew the other was already on their way toward the same constellation. Evening returned to the Glass Harbor, and with it, the same ocean shimmer that made the restaurant feel like it floated above the harbor. Mira Solis stepped off the staff elevator, tugging at the sleeves of her neatly ironed black dress. Her fingers still trembled when she thought about the night before, about the tattoo, the shattered glass, the look in that man's eyes. She had replayed it 100 times in her mind while scrubbing tables at the morning diner shift. Every version ended the same way, the disbelief in his face, her words hanging in the air like smoke. Now she was back again, the same floor, the same chandeliers, the same music that seemed too elegant for the lives of those who served beneath it. Carol, the floor manager, caught her by the wrist near the kitchen doors. "You're covering the VIP section again," she said. Mira froze. "The same table?" Carol nodded. "Mr. Reed specifically asked for you tonight. Be professional. Smile. And for God's sake, don't drop anything this time." Mira bit her lip. She didn't want to see him again, not after that moment of recognition, or whatever it had been. But refusing wasn't an option. Rent didn't care about emotions. So she tied her red apron tighter and stepped through the double doors into the dining hall. The world beyond was a painting. Candlelight reflected on crystal, conversations soft as velvet, and a faint echo of jazz spilling from the mezzanine. At the center booth sat Calvin Reed, posture effortless, composure returned. To his right was Brandon Pierce, younger, smug, radiating a self-importance only money could afford. Mira approached with the practiced grace of someone who had taught herself to vanish. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "May I take your order for drinks?" Brandon glanced at her, eyes sliding over her name tag. "You again," he said. "Didn't you cause a little incident yesterday?" Mira forced a polite smile. "A small one, sir. Everything's fine now?" "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way. Champagne, top shelf, and maybe something strong for our man of the hour here." He slapped Calvin's shoulder. "You just made the kind of deal that writes history books." Calvin didn't react. His attention was elsewhere, on Mira, who was trying to pour without spilling. Brandon leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You know, sweetheart, that bottle probably costs more than your car. Ever seen a $1,000 tab before?" The laughter from his side of the table felt sharp, brittle. Mira looked at him calmly. "No, sir, but I've seen people who think it makes them important." The air cooled instantly. Calvin's eyes flicked toward her, faint surprise crossing his features. Not at her courage, but at how familiar her quiet defiance felt. He took the glass she'd poured and spoke softly, without looking at Brandon. "Maybe she's right," he said. "Some people see value in things other than numbers." Brandon blinked. "Come on, Cal, lighten up. It's just a joke." But Calvin had already turned back to Mira. "Thank you. he said. She nodded slightly. Of course, sir. She turned to leave, but he spoke again. Wait. She stopped, tray balanced perfectly, though her pulse wasn't steady. He gestured toward the window beside their booth. Beyond it, the harbor stretched out, a dark sheet of glass scattered with city lights. The sky's clear tonight, he said. Do you know the constellations? Mira hesitated. A few. My mom used to teach me when I was little. Calvin's voice lowered. Do you know Lyra? Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that question. Her gaze followed his, out toward the faint sky above the water. Yes, she said finally. She used to tell me it sings. The words came out before she could stop them. Soft, simple, unthinking. A phrase so old it belonged to someone else's childhood. Calvin's glass paused halfway to his lips. He looked at her. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something unguarded and raw flickered for a heartbeat. What did you just say? Mira blinked. Lyra, my mom said it sings when someone remembers you. She smiled faintly. I always liked that. Calvin set his glass down slowly. The wine rippled inside. He remembered the night Dana had said those exact words. They had been lying on the pier, watching the stars above the bay. Lyra's not just a constellation, she'd told him. It's a harp. The legend says it plays songs that only those who are missed can hear. He hadn't thought about that night in decades. Now, a 19-year-old girl with Dana's quiet strength and her same thoughtful eyes was standing in front of him, speaking those words as if they'd been waiting inside her all along. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice steady. That's poetic. Mira tilted her head. It's a nice story. Brandon, oblivious to the tension, raised his glass. To poetry, then, and prophets. Mira excused herself quickly, slipping away before the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She reached the service corridor and leaned against the wall, heart pounding. Why had he looked at her like that? Why had that question about Lyra felt so personal? Behind her, the sound of laughter rose and fell again, the easy rhythm of people who had never worried about money or meaning. Mira steadied herself, adjusted her apron, and returned to her section. At the table, Calvin was silent. Brandon kept talking, but his words blurred into meaningless noise. Calvin's mind was somewhere else. A different winter, a different night. Dana's laughter under a broken telescope dome, her hair whipping in the wind as she said, if the stars could sing, they'd sound like forgiveness. He looked down at his wrist again, at the constellation inked there. The edges had faded over time, but tonight, under the golden light of the restaurant, it looked almost alive. Cal? Brandon snapped his fingers. You good? Calvin blinked, returning to the present. Fine, but he wasn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that fate had played a cruel trick, that the girl who spoke like Dana, who carried her grace and her stubborn honesty, wasn't just some stranger with a familiar face. He glanced toward the kitchen doors, where Mira disappeared moments ago. Her name echoed in his mind, overlapping with another voice, another time, Dana's voice. Promise me, she had said that last night, before everything fell apart. If you ever see Lyra again, remember it was supposed to sing for both of us. He'd forgotten, until now. When the check arrived, Brandon signed without looking, still laughing at his own jokes. Calvin stood, buttoning his jacket. I'll meet you outside. He walked to the front desk, stopping where Mira was placing. New reservations into the system. She looked up, startled. I wanted to apologize, he said quietly. For yesterday, I was surprised. You caught me off guard. Mira nodded slowly. It's all right, sir. I shouldn't have interrupted. You noticed something most people wouldn't have. I notice things, she said. It's kind of my job. A small smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. Well, he said, slipping a card onto the counter, if you ever need another job, call me. She looked at it, plain white, embossed name, Calvin Reed, and felt the same unease twist in her stomach. Thank you, she said quietly, not reaching for it. Calvin nodded once and walked out into the cold night, his reflection passing through the glass like a ghost leaving the room. Behind him, Mira stared after him, the card untouched, the harbor lights flickering in her eyes. For a second, she thought she heard it, faint, distant, impossible, a sound like a single string plucked far above the city, a harp in the stars. And though she didn't know it yet, that quiet note would follow both of them until the truth finally came home. Night settled over Dorchester like a held breath. The city's glow bled faintly through the window of the small attic, turning the frost on the glass into pale gold. The streets below were quiet, only the distant sound of a late bus and the hum of wind between buildings. Inside, Mira Solis sat cross-legged on her bed, her laptop balanced on her knees. The light from the screen washed her face in cold blue. Her mother's soft breathing came from the other side of the curtain, uneven, each inhale followed by a faint rattle. Mira hesitated before speaking. "Mom," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" Dana stirred. Mira turned the laptop slightly, the glow spilling across her hands. "At the restaurant, there was this man." Her voice trembled. "He had a tattoo, a constellation, Lyra, the same as yours, same coordinates, same date." The silence that followed was so complete that Mira thought her mother hadn't heard her. But then came a sound, the bed springs creaking as Dana sat upright, followed by a cough that tore through her chest. She covered her mouth, her breath hitching. "What did you just say?" Mira repeated quietly. "He has the same tattoo, Mom. Everything. Even the date." Dana's hands shook as she reached for the nightstand. Her inhaler lay there, empty again. Mira jumped up. "Here, I'll get—" "No," Dana gasped, voice rasping. Don't talk about that." "Why? Who is he?" "No one," Dana said quickly, her voice rising, too sharp, too desperate. "He's no one. Mira, please forget this." Her daughter stared at her. "You're scaring me." Dana's eyes glistened. "Then listen. Some things are meant to stay buried. Let it go." Mira wanted to ask more, but Dana's cough cut through the air again, violent, unrelenting. Mira rushed to her side, rubbing her back, whispering, "Breathe, Mom, please." When it finally passed, Dana sank into her pillow, exhausted. "Promise me," she whispered. "Don't go looking. Don't ask him anything." Mira sat in silence, her throat tight. "Okay," she lied. Later, when the coughing had stopped and her mother's breathing steadied, Mira sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment felt smaller at night, like the walls leaned closer to listen. She opened the notebook that had lain by Dana's bed, the one with the constellation map folded inside. Under the dim bulb, she unfolded it, tracing the coordinates written beneath the stars. 42.35 degree N, 7105 degree. Her heart thudded. She typed them into her laptop. The map zoomed in, revealing the shoreline of Boston Harbor, the very place her mother had once said she studied as a young astronomy student. And right there, glowing on the screen, was a red pin marking the exact coordinates. The waterfront, not far from the Glass Harbor restaurant itself. She leaned back, stunned. "What are the odds?" she whispered. Mira rubbed her eyes. Couldn't just be coincidence. The tattoo, the coordinates, the way Calvin Reed had looked at her like he'd seen a ghost. Something connected them, something her mother didn't want her to find. She clicked open a new email window. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't even know what she wanted to say. She only knew that her mother needed help, medical help, and that she was out of options. If Calvin Reed really was the man her mother once knew, maybe he could do something. And if he wasn't, then no one would ever know she'd asked. Her cursor blinked, waiting. Finally, she began to type. Subject: anonymous inquiry message. A woman needs a medical checkup. No insurance, can't afford the visit. Please don't ask questions. She stared at the message. Too vague, too strange. Her hand moved again, typing one more line. She lives in Dorchester. It's urgent. Her heart pounded as she read it back. She didn't sign her name. She didn't mention Dana. She didn't mention the tattoo or the night or anything that could connect them. She ended it simply. Thank you. Then she hesitated. Her finger hovered above the send button. What if he thinks it's spam? She whispered to herself. What if he ignores it? But what if he didn't? The sound of her mother's faint cough drifted from upstairs. Mira pressed send. The blue light blinked once, and the message vanished into the dark. The next morning, the first light of dawn crept across the rooftops. Snow clung to the window like fragile lace. Mira woke to the sound of her phone buzzing beside her pillow. She blinked against the brightness, heart skipping, when she saw the notification. One new email. Her pulse quickened as she tapped it open. From cr@readtech.com. Subject: Anonymous. Inquiry: Body, appointment confirmed, Bay State Medical Center, 12:30 p.m. tomorrow, paid in full. CR, Mira stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, half convinced it couldn't be real. She opened a browser and searched the clinic. It was one of the most expensive hospitals in the city, the kind that asked for credit checks before questions. Her mother's name wasn't mentioned, of course, but the signature, CR, left no doubt. Calvin Reed had answered. Downstairs, Dana shuffled into the kitchen, still in her robe, her hair pulled back. She smiled when she saw the kettle steaming. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Mira said, closing the laptop. Dana coughed softly and poured tea. "You work too much, sweetheart." "So do you," Mira said. "Or you did." Her mother smiled faintly. "You sound like my doctor." "Maybe you should actually have one," Mira murmured. Dana's hand froze halfway to her cup. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Mira said quickly. "Just, you need to take care of yourself." For a moment, their eyes met. Mira trying to look calm, Dana searching her daughter's face for the truth. "Did you do something?" Dana asked quietly. Mira forced a laugh. "Like what? Hack the insurance system?" "You're clever enough," Dana said. "But promise me, no more worrying. I'll be fine." Mira kissed her mother's forehead, her smile tight. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "You just rest." As Dana sat down, Mira turned away, hiding the tears stinging her eyes. She'd promised to let it go. But promises meant little when love demanded more. That night, after her mother had fallen asleep again, Mira opened the laptop once more. The screen glowed blue, lighting the room like a quiet secret. She reread Calvin's message, every word precise, impersonal, the kind of email sent by a man used to fixing problems with money. And yet, there was something in the finality of it, the way he hadn't asked who she was or why she'd written, that felt oddly human, as if he already knew. She clicked the message closed, the blue light flickering against her face. Outside, snow drifted through the city streets, silent, endless, and in that fragile stillness between guilt and relief, Mira whispered to the empty room, "Thank you." Her voice was swallowed by the dark, but somewhere across town, in a penthouse overlooking the harbor, another screen lit up. A man reading the same words, a single frown line between his eyes. He didn't reply again, but his hand lingered on his wrist, over the faded constellation inked into his skin. And in the morning, the first call he made wasn't to a business partner, but to a hospital. The waiting room at Bay State Medical Center smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, white walls, cold air, too much silence for a place meant to heal. Mira sat in a molded plastic chair, her fingers laced tightly around her mother's hand. Dana Solis looked smaller than usual in the hospital gown, her hair tied back, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. A nurse called her name, and Mira stood with her, steadying her mother as they walked toward the examination room. For the first time in years, Mira wasn't thinking about rent or shifts or bills. She was thinking about the email, about the man who'd answered it, about how something impossible had quietly begun to unfold the moment she'd pressed send. The nurse smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Dr. Patel's the best." Mira nodded, though worry was all she had left. She helped her mother onto the bed, tucked the thin blanket around her, and brushed a hand over Dana's arm. "You'll be okay," she whispered. Dana smiled weakly. "You sound like you believe it." "I do," Mira lied. Half an hour later, Dr. Patel entered, middle-aged, kind eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Solis," he said warmly, "we'll run some chest imaging and blood work. It shouldn't take long." Dana nodded, voice faint. "Thank you, doctor." He turned to Mira. "You can wait outside, young lady. There's coffee down the hall." Mira hesitated. "I'd rather stay." Dana gave her a reassuring smile. "Go on, I'll be fine." Mira finally stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed. The corridor was a long, gleaming stretch of white and light, everything polished, humming, precise. She sank into a chair outside the room, staring at the linoleum floor. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She frowned, answering softly. "Hello?" "Miss Solis?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Bay State Reception. Your sponsor has arrived. He'll meet you shortly." Mira's heart stopped for a second. "My what?" But before she could ask again, the elevator doors at the end of the corridor slid open. And Calvin Reed stepped out. The light from the fluorescent ceiling hit his tailored coat, the silver in his hair, the quiet authority that followed him like a shadow. He looked out of place here, too composed for the sterile world of illness and worry. Mira stood abruptly. "Mr. Reed?" He offered a polite nod. "Miss Solis, I was in the area. Thought I'd check if everything was all right. You were in the area of a public hospital in Dorchester?" His mouth twitched, the faintest trace of a smile. "Coincidence." Mira folded her arms, suspicious. "Did you pay for this?" He met her gaze evenly. "It's just a checkup. You shouldn't have to choose between care and survival." Her throat tightened. "We didn't ask for charity." He shook his head. "It's not charity, it's—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Compassion." Before she could answer, the exam room door opened. A nurse motioned for Mira. "Your mother's ready to see you." Inside, Dana sat on the bed, pale but calm. Dr. Patel was writing notes on his tablet. "We'll need to start antibiotics immediately. It looks like early pneumonia, possibly linked to chronic bronchitis. Nothing too advanced yet, but she'll need rest, inhalers, and follow-ups." He turned to Calvin without hesitation, as if they had spoken before. "The payment has already been processed, Mr. Reed." Mira's head snapped toward him. "You—" Calvin raised a hand gently. "Let's focus on your mother." Dana's eyes, once dull with fatigue, sharpened as she looked at him. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself forgot to move. Her lips parted. "Calvin?" she whispered. The name slipped out like breath she'd been holding for years. Calvin froze. The sound of it hit him harder than any accusation could. He took a slow step forward. His expression shifted, the calm mask fracturing into disbelief. "Dana," his voice cracked, quiet, reverent. Mira looked between them, confusion knitting her brow. "You know each other?" Dana's fingers trembled against the blanket. Her voice was barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." "I didn't know," Calvin said quickly. "I didn't until now." The doctor, sensing the undercurrent of something private, cleared his throat politely. "I'll give you a moment." He slipped out, closing the door behind him. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Dana broke the silence. "After all these years, why now?" Calvin's gaze fell to the floor. "Because your daughter sent me an email." Mira's heart skipped. "I didn't use your name." "You didn't have to," he said softly. "You wrote about someone who needed help but couldn't afford it. I remembered someone like that once." Dana turned away, her voice shaking. "You shouldn't have come." Calvin's voice was low, remorse threading through it. "If I'd known it was you, I'd have come sooner." "Don't lie to make peace with yourself." "I'm not lying," he said. "I thought you were gone, Dana." Mira's voice broke between them. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" Neither answered right away. Dana's breathing grew uneven. "Please, Mira, let's go home." Calvin took a step closer. "She should stay, at least for observation. I'll cover the stay, no conditions." Dana's chin lifted, fragile pride flaring. "I don't take money from strangers." Calvin met her eyes. "Then take it from an old mistake trying to make things right." The room went still. Mira looked from one to the other, the sense of something enormous unfolding, a truth too heavy for words. Her mother's face had drained of color, and Calvin's looked as though he had seen a ghost made of guilt. She whispered, "You're the man from her stories, aren't you?" Calvin blinked. "What stories?" "The ones she stopped finishing." He didn't answer. Dana turned away, exhausted. "Mira, please, take me home." Outside, snow flurried across the hospital's glass facade. Mira supported her mother down the steps, the cold wind stealing their breath. Calvin followed, silent, stopping near the curb where his driver waited. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a small card. "If you need medication or transportation, call this number. They'll handle everything. You don't have to go through the front desk." Mira stared at the card but didn't take it. "We're not your project, Mr. Reed." He nodded. "I know." Then, more softly, "Helping someone shouldn't need conditions." Dana's voice trembled behind her. "You always knew how to say the right thing too late." Calvin looked at her one last time, the woman he'd left behind, the echo of the life he might have had. "I'm glad you're alive," he said simply. Then he turned toward the waiting car. Mira watched him go, the snow swirling around his figure until the black coat disappeared into white. She looked down at the card, still warm in her hand. The gold letters read, "Reed Foundation, Private Medical Support Line." She whispered to the night, "You didn't come by coincidence." And though the wind carried her words away, somewhere inside she knew the stars that had marked both their lives had started to move again. Snow whispered against the attic window like a memory that refused to fade. The old building creaked in the wind, each sound reminding Mira Solis how fragile their little world was. It was almost midnight when the knock came. 3 slow taps, hesitant, deliberate. She stirred from her desk, startled. Who would be here at this hour? From the bed across the room, Dana half opened her eyes. Her cough had worsened that night. The antibiotics hadn't yet taken hold. Probably a neighbor, she murmured weakly. But when Mira opened the door, it wasn't a neighbor. It was Calvin Reed. He stood beneath the flickering hallway bulb, snow melting in his hair, his black coat dusted with frost. In his hand, he held a small white paper bag. "I brought the new prescription," he said quietly. "The hospital said the pharmacy was out of stock earlier, so I had it delivered." Mira froze, heart caught between anger and confusion. "How do you even know where we live?" "I asked Dr. Patel," Calvin replied. "He thought it might help if the medication arrived tonight." Mira hesitated, torn between gratitude and suspicion. Before she could respond, Dana's voice rose from inside, sharp, frightened. "Mira, who is it?" Mira turned, but before she could answer, Dana's gaze found the figure in the doorway, her face drained of color. "Calvin," she whispered, barely audible. He stepped forward, removing his gloves. "I didn't mean to startle you." Dana clutched the edge of the blanket, trembling. "You shouldn't have come here." "I needed to," Calvin said. "Not for me, for you." Her voice hardened. "I told you, we don't need your charity." "This isn't charity," he said softly. "It's a debt." Mira looked between them, her chest tightening. "Mom, what's going on?" Dana didn't answer. She turned away, coughing, her shoulders shaking. Calvin set the bag gently on the table, his expression full of things unspoken. When Dana finally caught her breath, she looked at him again, really looked. "You still have it," she said faintly. "That mark on your arm?" Calvin rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faded constellation. "Lyra," he said, "still here. I couldn't erase it even if I wanted to." Dana's composure cracked. Why come back now, after 25 years? Why open wounds that were finally closing? He took a breath that sounded heavier than the night itself. "Because I saw her," he said, his eyes flicking toward Mira. "And because I realized I'd already lost too much time pretending the past was dead." Dana's voice trembled. "You made your choice. You gave me money and told me to—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "You told me to make it disappear." Calvin's throat tightened. "I was 21. My father had threatened to cut me off. I panicked." "Don't excuse it," Dana whispered. "You knew what it meant. You knew what you asked me to do." "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "From my family, from scandal, from myself." Dana laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "Protecting me? You broke me." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the old radiator. Finally, Calvin spoke again, his voice low. "When I came to find you, you were gone. You changed your number. I searched for months. You didn't search hard enough." "You're right," he said. "I didn't." Her tears spilled then, hot, uncontrollable. "I was pregnant, Calvin." He froze. "I didn't go through with it," she said. "I wanted to. I tried, but I couldn't. And when I told you I'd miscarried, it wasn't true. I was terrified of being alone, of being judged, of watching you walk away for good, so I left first." The silence that followed was unbearable. Calvin stepped closer, voice breaking. "Dana, are you saying—" She nodded through tears. "She's yours." Behind the half-closed door, Mira stood frozen. Her hand gripped the wall, her mind spinning. "She's yours." The words hit her like a wave that knocked the breath from her lungs. All the pieces she hadn't been able to fit together, her mother's tattoo, the way Calvin had looked at her, the way fate had pulled them back, suddenly aligned into a truth too big to carry. She sank to her knees for a moment, her breath shaking. Then she stood. Pushing open the door, she stepped inside. Dana gasped. "Mira, no!" Mira's voice trembled, but didn't falter. "So, it's true," Calvin turned, his eyes wide, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Mira, don't say my name like that," she said. "You both knew. You both knew something, and I've been standing in the dark my whole life." Dana reached for her. Sweetheart, please, it's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Mira cried. You lied to me, Mom. You told me he left. You told me my father didn't exist. Dana's lips trembled. I did it to protect you. From what? The truth? Calvin's voice broke in softly, trying to steady the storm. Don't be angry with her, Mira. I'm the one who walked away. Mira turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. And I'm the one who grew up watching her fight to survive because of it. The words hung there, heavy and sharp. No one moved. Then, quietly, she said, You both hurt each other, and you both hurt me. But standing here, looking at you now, I think you both still love what was lost. Dana's face softened, her tears shimmering in the dim light. Calvin looked at the floor, then at her, then at Mira, the living proof of every mistake he'd made. He whispered, I never stopped thinking about her. Dana shook her head, whispering, It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me, Mira said, because I'm part of it. And I think maybe we can't fix what's broken, but we can stop pretending it never existed. Calvin's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't deserve forgiveness. Mira looked between them, the two people who had shaped her life, without realizing it. Then start by earning it, she said. Both of you. Her voice softened. You for leaving, and you, she turned to her mother, for hiding. Dana covered her face, sobbing quietly. I thought I was doing what was right. I know, Mira whispered, but I needed the truth more than protection. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was fragile, trembling, alive. Calvin stepped forward slowly, his eyes glistening. I'll leave if you want me to. Mira shook her head. Not tonight. We've had enough running for one lifetime. She motioned to the chair. Sit. Tell me who you both were before you became strangers. And so, for the first time in 25 years, 3 lives sat under one roof, bound by regret, truth, and something faintly resembling hope. Outside, the snow kept falling. The wind rattled the old window, but inside, something steadier began to take shape. A fragile bridge built on a single word neither had dared to say until now. Family. The storm began quietly, and as all storms do, with whispers. By the end of the week, those whispers had become a roar that filled every corner of Boston. The headline hit the morning broadcasts first. Billionaire Calvin Reed secretly funding Waitress and her mother. And then, as if hungry for scandal, the tabloids twisted it further. The hidden family of a tycoon? Affair or charity? Inside Reed's midnight visits. Mira read it all on her cracked phone screen while serving coffee at the diner that morning. Her hands shook so hard the tray rattled. The customer's eyes followed her, curious, pitying, cruel. Behind the counter, the cook muttered, That's the guy from Reed Tech, right? The billionaire? Someone else whispered, She's the girl, the waitress. Poor thing. Mira's ears rang. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't let her wake. When her phone buzzed again, she flinched. It was Calvin. One line, Don't speak to anyone, I'll fix this. But the damage was already done. By noon, reporters were camped outside the diner. By evening, they were outside her building. Across town, in the mirrored halls of Reed Enterprises, Calvin stood by the window of his office on the 36th floor. His reflection fractured against the city skyline. Brandon Pierce just leaked another story, his assistant said nervously. He's implying a financial arrangement. Calvin's jaw tightened. Of course he is. Pierce, his ambitious protege turned rival, had waited years for a weakness. Now he'd found one, a poor waitress, and the truth Calvin had kept too long buried. Should I issue a denial? The assistant asked. No, Calvin said coldly. We won't deny the wrong thing. He turned, voice firm. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I'll address it myself. The assistant blinked. Sir, if you go public, then the story stops owning me, Calvin interrupted. It's time I told it myself. He walked to his desk, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside, beneath the glass, was a metal plaque engraved with words he hadn't read in years. To the stars we promised. He slipped the plaque into his pocket and looked back at the skyline, his empire glittering like ice. Lyra, he murmured, you were never about love. You were about redemption. That night, at the attic apartment, Dana sat at the small table, her hands trembling over a mug of untouched tea. Mira stood by the window, blinds drawn, watching camera flashes spark outside on the street. "They won't stop," Mira said quietly. "They're taking pictures of our windows, Mom." Dana's voice was soft, exhausted. "It'll pass." "You said that yesterday." "I know." Mira turned to her. "Why didn't you tell me who he was, before all this, before the world decided to guess for us?" Dana took a shaky breath. "Because I was ashamed." "Of what?" "Of the choices I made," Dana whispered. "Of leaving him, of raising you alone, of pretending I was strong when I was just scared." Her eyes glistened with tears. "You deserved a father, Mira. I kept you from him because I couldn't bear to see him look at you and see his mistake." Mira's throat tightened. "He's not my mistake." Dana looked up, startled, then nodded, her tears falling freely. "No," she said, voice trembling. "You're the only thing I ever did right." The two women stood there in silence, the weight of years between them, pain, protection, love, all tangled together. Then Dana added quietly, "But it's time you knew everything. That tattoo, Lyra, it wasn't just a promise between lovers. It was a confession, a mark of guilt he couldn't wash away." Mira's gaze fell to her mother's wrist. The faded constellation shimmered faintly under the lamplight. "And you kept yours," Mira said softly. Dana smiled weakly. "So did he." The next morning, the world watched. Every major network carried the same live feed. A sleek stage, a line of microphones, and Calvin Reed standing before a wall of cameras. He looked calm, too calm for a man in the eye of a scandal. "Good morning," he began. His voice carried the steady cadence of someone who'd rehearsed truth his entire life, but never spoken it aloud. "I know what's being said about me. Some of it is false. Some of it is not." The room fell silent. He continued, 25 years ago, I made choices that hurt people. A woman I loved and someone I didn't know existed, until now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed like lightning. Calvin raised a hand. "I won't discuss names or details. Not out of secrecy, but out of respect. What I will say is this. When you have more than you need, you have a responsibility to help those who have less. I failed to do that once. I will not fail again." He turned toward the screen behind him, where a new logo appeared, a stylized constellation, Lyra Health Foundation. "A foundation," he announced, "to provide free healthcare access to low-income women and families, funded entirely by Reed Enterprises, effective immediately." He paused, letting the silence settle. "This isn't penance, it's purpose." Reporters shouted questions. "Who are they? Is this connected to the rumors?" Calvin met their eyes and said simply, "What matters isn't who they are, it's who we become when we finally stop running from the truth." And with that, he stepped away from the podium. The flashbulbs erupted again, but this time, he didn't flinch. Back in Dorchester, Mira and Dana watched the live broadcast on the tiny television perched between the kitchen shelves. Calvin's image flickered across the screen, steady, composed, defiant against the chaos he'd created. Dana wiped her eyes. He didn't have to do that. Mira shook her head. He did. For once, he didn't hide. The reporter's voice overlaid the footage. Calvin Reed's announcement has already drawn praise from healthcare advocates. The Lyra Health Foundation promises to support thousands of families annually. Still, speculation continues about the women who inspired the program. Mira reached for the remote and muted the sound. The silence that followed felt heavier, but gentler. She turned to her mother. "Do you think this makes things right?" Dana hesitated. "No," she said finally, "but it means he's trying, and maybe that's a start." Mira nodded slowly. Her eyes returned to the TV screen, where the constellation of Lyra shimmered behind Calvin's name. "People think tattoos are about love," she said quietly, "but sometimes they're about regret, about carving your mistakes so deep into your skin that you can never forget." Dana smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the only way to remember what matters." Later that night, when the reporters finally left, Mira stepped onto the small balcony. The snow had stopped. The city glowed beneath her, cold, endless, alive. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I can't undo the past, but I can make sure the world learns from it. See," she typed back, after a long pause. "Then start with us." She hit send and looked up at the night sky. Above the roofs and towers, the constellation Lyra shimmered faintly. Not a promise this time, but a reminder. Some mistakes aren't erased, they're transformed. The glass dome of the Boston Planetarium shimmered like a bubble caught between two worlds, one of Earth and one of stars. It was late evening, and the city outside was wrapped in snow, but inside the dome, the air hummed with quiet anticipation. Mira Solis stood near the center aisle, clutching her coat tighter around her. The dark velvet seats curved around her like a quiet ocean. Overhead, 1,000 artificial stars flickered to life, slow, deliberate, breathtaking. She had been hesitant to come. Calvin's message had been simple. Meet me at the place where the sky begins. She hadn't replied, but curiosity, and something deeper, quieter, had brought her here anyway. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. Thank you for coming, Calvin said. He was dressed more simply than she'd ever seen him. No tie, no gleaming cufflinks, just a man in a dark sweater, his eyes reflecting the stars above. Mira kept her voice steady. You didn't say why. I wanted to show you something, he said, gesturing to the ceiling. The projector rotated with a faint mechanical sigh, and the lights dimmed until only the dome remained alive, a swirl of galaxies in motion. A voice from the speaker began narrating softly, the tone reverent. Lyra, the harp of Orpheus, a constellation of love, loss, and music. Its brightest star, Vega, guides travelers home. The sound faded, leaving only the illusion of infinite space. Mira looked up, the reflection of stars dancing in her eyes. It's beautiful, Calvin nodded. I used to come here when I was in college. Before everything. She turned slightly toward him. Before my mother? He smiled faintly, a sad, worn thing. Before I became the man who thought success could replace meaning. Mira said nothing. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore, just heavy, honest. Calvin took a slow breath. You were right that night, about running, about hiding. I spent half my life letting other people write my story. My father, the board, the press. I thought power would make me free. It didn't. It just made me lonely. He paused, eyes fixed on the dome. Your mother was the only one who saw me before the world did, and I threw that away. Mira's voice was quiet. And now? Now, he said, I want to rewrite it. Not with words, with actions. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim folder, navy blue, embossed with a constellation of silver dots. He placed it gently on the seat beside her. What's this? She asked. A scholarship, he said. The Solis Education Grant, named after your mother, and after you, for students working double shifts while trying to study, for those who've been told survival is all they can aim for. Mira blinked, stunned. You made this for us? For anyone like you, Calvin said. You once told me you wanted to finish school. I can't buy back 19 years, but I can make sure someone else doesn't lose theirs. She stared at the folder, the light from Vega glimmering across its cover. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say no if you want to, he said gently. It's not about repayment. It's about a beginning. Mira lifted the folder, tracing the embossed letters with her fingers. The weight of it felt both impossible and necessary. Inside, she could see the paperwork. The official seal, her name, a letter of acceptance waiting only for her signature. Her throat tightened. You think this fixes everything? No, Calvin said immediately. It doesn't fix anything. It just plants something new in the ground we burned. Mira let out a shaky laugh, half bitter, half breaking. That's poetic, he smiled faintly. Maybe your mother's influence. She used to say stars were proof that beauty could survive distance. Mira looked down at the glowing dome floor, her voice softer now. She still says that. Then maybe, Calvin said, we can learn from her. For a while they just stood there, two silhouettes under a man-made sky, connected by light older than forgiveness. Finally, Mira spoke again, her tone steady. You can't buy back 19 years, Mr. Reed, but you can start by listening. Calvin nodded slowly. Then I'm listening. She met his eyes. I don't need a benefactor. I don't even need a father right now. I just need you not to vanish again. He swallowed hard. I won't. Not this time. You always say that, she said quietly. I've only said it once, he replied. To someone who mattered. Mira didn't answer right away. She opened the folder again, staring at her own name beside the foundation's crest. Then she closed it and looked up. "Okay," she said, "I'll accept it. Not because of the money, but because of what it means." He tilted his head. "And what's that?" "That maybe forgiveness isn't a word," she said. "It's a chance." The projector shifted again, illuminating the dome with a cascade of blue and silver light. The stars moved in slow rotation until Lyra appeared, its shape unmistakable, a bright diamond strung by invisible strings of light. Calvin looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "To the stars we promised." Mira smiled, soft but resolute. "Then let's keep the promise this time." After the show ended, the dome lights rose gently, revealing their reflections in the curved glass wall. For a moment, the reflection looked almost like another version of them, one where the years hadn't fractured anything, where a father and daughter could simply exist without history in between. At the exit, Calvin paused. "You know," he said quietly, "your mother used to hum a melody whenever she studied the stars. She said Lyra was the harp that could bring the dead back to life." Mira nodded. Maybe she was right, maybe not literally, but in her own way. Calvin smiled. She was always right. Mira looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the myth, but a man who was trying to learn how to live differently. "Good night, Mr. Reed," she said, turning toward the door. "Calvin," he corrected softly. She hesitated. "Good night, Calvin." And as she walked out into the cold night, the sky above Boston seemed to echo the dome, the real stars mirroring the artificial ones, as if both were conspiring to give the same quiet message. Some promises break, others wait, until we're ready to keep them. Time did what apologies could not. It softened the edges. It filled the spaces words had failed to reach. Weeks passed quietly after the scandal faded, after the headlines shifted to newer storms. And in the small attic apartment that had once held only coughs and worry, the air began to change. Dana Solis no longer woke to the sound of her own ragged breath. The inhaler sat untouched for days at a time. Her cough had softened into a whisper, then into nothing at all. She spent her mornings by the window, a blanket draped over her knees, sunlight warming the pages of an old notebook, the notebook she hadn't opened in 25 years. Its first entry read, "Lyra, June 14th, 2000, the night everything changed." For the first time, Dana didn't cry as she wrote. She simply smiled. The quiet smile of someone who had stopped running from her own past. Her handwriting wavered across the lines, slow but steady. She wrote about love, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that survives destruction. And at the bottom of one page, she added a sentence she'd never thought she'd write. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about breathing again." Downstairs, Mira slipped on her coat and slung her bag over her shoulder. She checked her watch, 6:45 a.m., another long day ahead. Mornings were for class at Boston State University, where she'd been accepted as an audit student through the Solis grant. Evenings were for work, the dinner shift at a small cafe near the harbor. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was still low, the nights still cold. But for the first time in her life, Mira didn't feel trapped. She walked into lecture halls filled with people who had never known hunger, never worked double shifts, never worried about bills. And she didn't feel lesser. She felt determined. During breaks, she studied in the library, her textbooks covered in notes, her hands always faintly smelling of coffee and sanitizer. Sometimes she looked out the tall glass windows at the harbor and thought of Calvin, of what he'd said under the planetarium dome. "You can't rewrite the past, but you can write what comes next." She was writing hers, line by line. Every few days, a small brown package arrived at their door. Inside, neatly wrapped, were Dana's medications, vitamins, and sometimes tea. Each one included a small card, no signature, no address, just 2 words written in the same steady handwriting. "Keep breathing." Dana would place the card on the shelf by the window, beside the small ceramic vase where she kept fresh daisies from the market. By the 3rd week, there were 4 cards lined up like quiet sentinels. Mira noticed them one night and smiled faintly. "You could frame those." Dana looked up from her notebook. "Why would I?" "Because they're small miracles," Mira said softly. "Not everyone gets a second chance to hear 'keep breathing' from the person who once took their breath away." Dana chuckled. "You've been spending too much time in literature class." "Maybe," Mira said, but her eyes lingered on the cards. She'd never replied to Calvin's last message. "I'm listening." And yet, somehow, Silence had become their way of speaking. Meanwhile, across the city, the world of billionaires kept spinning. Only this time, Calvin Reed wasn't standing at its center. In the gleaming boardroom of Reed Enterprises, voices rose in frustration. "Mr. Reed, with all due respect," one executive argued, "backing out of the Titan merger will cost millions." Calvin stood at the window, hands in his pockets, gaze on the skyline. "It'll cost us more," he said quietly, "if we keep pretending profit is purpose." The room fell silent. Behind him, Brandon Pierce shifted uncomfortably. He had been quiet all meeting, his usual arrogance replaced by something uneasy. He had reason to be, because that morning an internal investigation had landed on Calvin's desk. Emails traced, records verified. It was Brandon who had leaked the story to the press. Calvin turned at last, his expression unreadable. "Brandon," he said evenly, "you wanted a headline. I'll give you one. Reed Tech dismisses executive for ethical breach. That's yours." Brandon's face drained of color. "You can't—" "I already did." Calvin's voice was calm, final. "You wanted to destroy something to rise higher. You forgot that destruction only ever pulls you down." Security escorted Brandon out as the rest of the team watched in stunned silence. Calvin took a breath and faced them. "Gentlemen, we're done chasing shadows. The merger is off. We'll redirect funding to the Lyra Health Foundation and the Solis Grant. That's our new legacy." One of the board members frowned. "You're turning a corporation into a charity?" Calvin looked at him steadily. "I'm turning it into something that matters." Outside the glass wall, snow drifted over the city. Slow, silent, cleansing. That evening, Calvin walked alone along the Boston Harbor. The tide lapped quietly against the docks, reflecting the faint gold of streetlights. The same place where, years ago, a young man had promised the stars everything and broken it all instead. Now, the man who stood there felt lighter, stripped of the noise, the armor, the endless performance. He watched a group of children chase each other near the pier, their laughter cutting through the cold. One of them pointed up at the sky. "Look, that one's Vega!" Calvin smiled. Somewhere above the city haze, Lyra was shining again. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then typed a short message. "To Mira Solis, I passed by the harbor today. It reminded me that forgiveness isn't a finish line, it's a direction." He didn't send it. He just looked at it for a moment, then deleted it, trusting that some messages didn't need delivery to reach the heart they were meant for. Back at the attic, Mira returned home late, her fingers numb from the winter air. She opened the door to find her mother asleep, the notebook open beside her. On the page, Dana had written only 2 words in shaky script, "Still breathing." Mira smiled and closed the notebook gently. She turned off the lamp and stood by the window, watching the snow fall through the orange streetlight. The city seemed quieter these days, or maybe it was just her heart learning to rest. And somewhere out there, she knew, Calvin was walking the same streets under the same sky, trying, just like them, to start again. Time hadn't erased their scars. It had simply taught them how to live around them. And sometimes, that was enough. The little Italian restaurant sat tucked between 2 bookshops on Hanover Street, the kind of place that smelled like basil and memories. Its windows glowed with soft amber light, fogged by the warmth inside. Outside, the city hummed in early spring, quiet, cautious, alive. Inside, 3 people sat at a corner table, surrounded by the low murmur of strangers' laughter. Mira Solis unfolded the napkin in her lap, trying not to show how nervous she felt. Across from her, Calvin Reed studied the wine list with deliberate calm, and beside her, Dana smiled politely at the waiter, as though this were any ordinary dinner. It wasn't. It was the first time they had sat together, really together, in exactly a year. "Still your favorite spot?" Calvin asked, glancing at Dana. She nodded, her expression softening. "You remembered." "I remember everything now," he said quietly. The waiter poured wine into their glasses, the liquid catching the light like melted rubies. When he left, silence filled the space again, awkward but not hostile, just the silence of people learning how to breathe the same air after too many years apart. Mira was the first to break it. "So," she said with a small smile, "I'm impressed. No reporters, no headlines, no photographers hiding behind the breadbasket." Calvin chuckled. "I've gotten better at being invisible." Dana tilted her head. "You never were invisible, Calvin. Just unreachable." He looked down at his glass. "Maybe that's the truest thing anyone said about me." Mira's smile faded, replaced by something gentler. Then maybe tonight can change that. The waiter brought steaming plates, pasta tangled in herbs, bread still warm from the oven. The three of them began to eat, conversation tentative at first. "How's school?" Calvin asked. "Good," Mira said. "Harder than I thought, but good," he smiled. "You sound like your mother." Dana laughed softly. "That's either a compliment or an apology. I'll take it as both." Then, after a pause, she set down her fork. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. "There's something I've wanted to say for a long time," she began. Mira looked up. So did Calvin. Dana's voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered. "For years, I told myself I lied to protect myself. That leaving was survival, but it was fear. Fear disguised as pride. I didn't want to face what I'd lost, or what I'd done. I used the lie to keep breathing." Calvin's expression softened, regret flickering across his face. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "I spent half my life choosing money over people. It was easier to sign checks than to say sorry. Easier to build skyscrapers than rebuild trust." He looked at her across the table, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought success would keep me safe, but it only made the silence louder." Dana nodded slowly. "We both built walls out of fear. I just made mine smaller." Mira listened in silence, the sound of their shared confession filling the room more than the clinking of glasses ever could. Then she spoke, her tone firm but warm. "I don't need perfect parents," she said. "I just need people who stop pretending to be unbreakable." Both Dana and Calvin turned to her. Mira continued. "All my life, I watched the two of you fight ghosts. Guilt, regret, shame. And you know what? They don't disappear when you run. They just wait for you to come back." Dana reached for her daughter's hand. "You shouldn't have had to carry any of that." Mira squeezed her mother's fingers. "Maybe, but carrying it taught me how to put it down." Calvin looked between them, emotion swelling behind his calm. "You're stronger than both of us combined," Mira smiled faintly. "Maybe that's because I'm made from both of you." A comfortable silence followed. For the first time, it didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. Calvin leaned back slightly, the candlelight painting soft gold across his face. "You know," he said, "a year ago, I would have tried to fix everything with money or grand gestures, but I've learned that the smallest things last longer." He gestured to the table, the chipped plates, the mismatched chairs, the little flame dancing in its glass holder. "Like this, just a table, just the three of us. That's enough." Dana nodded. "It is." Mira raised her glass, her eyes shimmering with the reflection of the candle. "Then let's make it count." They touched glasses. 3 soft chimes in the quiet room. The waiter came by again, smiling. "Dessert?" Dana smiled back. "Just the check, thank you." But before the waiter could leave, Calvin said, "Actually, we'll take the tiramisu, 3 spoons." Dana arched an eyebrow. "You still order like you're in charge," he grinned. "Old habits die hard." The tiramisu arrived, and for a few moments they ate in companionable silence, sharing bites, exchanging small smiles that said more than conversation could. As Mira reached for her napkin, her gaze caught something, the faint shimmer on Calvin's wrist as he lifted his glass. The Lyra tattoo, once dark and sharp, had faded into soft gray lines, barely visible now, like a constellation dissolving into dawn. Her voice softened. "It's almost gone." Calvin followed her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "Time erases even the things we thought would last forever." Dana looked at him, then at the mark. Maybe that's what healing looks like. The pain fades, but the memory stays. Calvin turned his wrist slightly, the fading stars catching the candlelight. "I used to think it was a promise I failed to keep," he said. "Now I think it's just proof that I once believed in something worth promising." Mira smiled through the lump in her throat. "Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to believe again." They fell silent, their hands inching toward the center of the table. First Dana's, then Mira's, then Calvin's. 3 hands overlapping under the golden glow of the candle. The flame flickered, casting dancing reflections across the half-empty glasses, the wine glinting like captured sunsets. Outside, the city lights blurred behind the frosted window, distant and forgiving. And for a rare, precious moment, there was no past and no future. Only the present, fragile and whole. Calvin looked at them, the 2 people who had undone his solitude, and felt something shift quietly inside him. Not redemption, not triumph, but peace. He whispered, almost to himself. To the stars we promised. Dana smiled. To the table we kept. Mira added softly, and to whatever comes next. The camera of life seemed to pull back, from the table, from the candle, from their joined hands, until the three of them were just silhouettes inside a warm circle of light, surrounded by a city that no longer felt so cold. 2 years later, the harbor no longer looked like the place where their stories had fallen apart. It looked like where they had begun again. The city of Boston stretched in quiet gold beneath a late summer sky. Ships rocked gently against the docks, the air tasting faintly of salt and promise. And in a school building near the waterfront, painted bright blue by volunteers from the Lara Foundation, children's laughter filled every hallway. At the front of one classroom stood Mira Solis, 21 now, chalk dust on her fingertips and sunlight in her hair. She was explaining constellations to a group of fourth graders, her favorite subject to teach. So, when you look up at the sky, she said, sketching a cluster of tiny stars across the board, this is Lyra, the harp. People used to believe it could sing so beautifully that it moved even the heavens. A boy raised his hand. Can it still sing? Mira smiled. It does. You just have to listen for it. Not with your ears, but with your heart. The children giggled, but they listened. And as she looked at them, Mira felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not as the absence of struggle, but as the presence of meaning. When the bell rang, she helped the last student pack up and walked to the courtyard, where a stage had been set for that evening's ceremony. Rows of folding chairs faced a banner that read, "The Lyra Education and Health Fund, First Annual Scholarship Awards." Beneath it, small lights twinkled like captured stars. By sunset, the courtyard was full. Parents, students, teachers, and community members gathered to celebrate. The sound of the harbor mixed with music and applause as people took their seats. At the front row sat Calvin Reed, now 50, but somehow lighter than before. His expensive suits had given way to simple linen shirts and quiet confidence. Beside him sat Dana Solis, vibrant and healthy, wearing a navy shawl embroidered with silver stars. She had become the foundation's community advisor, counseling families who reminded her of the woman she used to be. When Mira stepped onto the stage, the audience fell silent. She stood before the microphone, the ocean wind playing with the loose strands of her hair. For a second, she thought of the girl she used to be, exhausted, unseen, serving strangers for tips, and she smiled. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear, steady. 2 years ago, I thought the only things written in the stars were for other people, people with power, people with luck. I didn't know that sometimes the smallest marks can light an entire life. She looked toward Calvin and Dana, her gaze warm. Tonight, we're not just giving scholarships. We're giving chances. Chances to breathe, to dream, to start again. Because someone once told me that help without condition is the truest form of love. Applause broke out, echoing across the courtyard like waves. Calvin's eyes glistened as he watched her. Dana reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. Mira continued. This foundation began with a story, not of perfection, but of mistakes that found meaning. So, if you ever doubt your worth, look up. Remember that the same sky holds both the stars and the storms, and somehow both belong. She closed her speech with a quiet smile. To the Lyra constellation, and to everyone who dares to find light in the dark. Thank you. The audience rose in a standing ovation, and as Mira stepped down from the stage, she caught sight of Calvin standing near the side, proud, teary-eyed, but letting her take every bit of the applause herself. Later that night, when the ceremony ended and the last of the guests had left, the three of them walked toward the pier behind the school. The wooden planks creaked beneath their steps. The sea shimmered with the reflection of city lights. They sat together at the edge, Dana between them, her shawl fluttering gently in the breeze. Above, the night sky stretched wide and clear. The stars blinked faintly through the haze, and somewhere near the horizon, Lyra appeared, its harp-shaped pattern glowing faintly in silver. Mira pointed upward. "There it is," she whispered. Calvin followed her gaze. "Still singing?" "Always," Mira said. Dana leaned her head on her daughter's shoulder. "I used to watch it when I thought everything was over," she murmured. "Now I watch it to remember how far we've come." Calvin smiled faintly. "I thought money could build anything, but it turns out it can't build peace. That took you too." Mira turned toward him, her voice soft. You built it with us, Dad. It was the first time she had said it aloud. The word lingered in the air, fragile and luminous. Calvin blinked hard, caught off guard. He looked at her, then at Dana, and for a moment he didn't speak. He just reached out and took both their hands, his palms warm against the cool night air. The wind brushed across their faces, carrying the scent of salt and the faint hum of the harbor. Mira whispered, "Do you ever think about that night, when everything started?" Calvin nodded. "Every day, but not with regret anymore." Dana smiled. "Then what with?" "With gratitude," he said simply. "For second chances, for this." He looked at the constellation again, the harp of light strung across the darkness. "To the stars we promised," he said softly. Dana added, her voice tender, "and finally reached." They sat in silence after that, 3 silhouettes against the soft glow of the city, the waves below them like quiet applause. The camera of life would have pulled back then, from the pier, from the 3 hands still joined, from the faint shimmer of Lyra above, until they became small, almost indistinguishable from the stars themselves. And maybe that was the point, that after all the noise, all the storms, all the loss and learning, life didn't need to be perfect to be complete. It only needed truth, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. As the tide rolled gently beneath them, Calvin whispered a final line, more to the night than to anyone in particular. "Some promises aren't broken. They just take a lifetime to keep." Mira smiled, her eyes still on the stars. "Then we kept ours." Dana squeezed their hands, the 3 of them framed by the quiet hum of the harbor. Above them, Lyra shimmered brighter than ever, a constellation reborn, a song only they could hear.